And now just a brief look at some of the stories developing around the globe in Meanwhile In. Meanwhile, in Germany, we've got some more details about those who were killed in an apparent crossbow sex cult attack. I've never said that sentence before, I don't know if anyone has, but it's true and it's pretty sad. So investigators believe that two victims, Torsten Weiss and Kirsten Enders, took knockout drugs and agreed to be killed by 30-year-old Farina Kaspari, who was also found dead in an otherwise quaint bed and breakfast in the picturesque Bavarian town of Passau. They were killed with a crossbow. That's just brutal. But the reason that they were killed and the reason they apparently allowed themselves to be killed is perhaps even sadder. They weren't the only ones too. There were two more women found dead in Kaspari's apartment about 400 miles away. So this is a cult that apparently had people in different parts of Germany too. Investigators believe that the fivesome were in a cult-like group centered around Weiss, who ran a medieval fetish shop and was described by a former member of the group as dominant and manipulative. Now, depending on which news source you listen to, they apparently believed that if they drugged themselves and allowed themselves to be killed with a crossbow, they would ascend to some sort of vaguely defined higher realm, which of course reminds you of a lot of other cults too. But it's really sad, and you have to think, like, when people first got involved with this medieval fetish store or started hanging out with these people, they had no idea what they were signing up for. And it reminds me in some ways of a lot of the different forms of online radicalization that we see around politics and ideology. So just as you're doing your online stuff, be careful of who you're getting mixed up with. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, a gun turn-in program is working out pretty well so far. Thousands of guns have been turned into New Zealand police as part of a nationwide gun buyback program created after a massacre earlier this year left 51 people dead. By last weekend, by Sunday, over 10,000 firearms had been turned into police, according to a New Zealand police spokesperson. Another 1,269 had been handed in under amnesty. Now that, look, obviously that's great for New Zealand, and it shows that, like with Australia, in the wake of a horrible tragedy, they decided to change their laws the way they needed to be changed, and it apparently is going quite well, and people have been fully willing to turn in their firearms. Now, I know that the news isn't always supposed to be about the United States, but we've talked about these sorts of programs before in the US, and there's always this assumption that, no, people won't turn in their guns. And the sentence is never actually finished after that. But what people are saying or think is that these people are so devoted to hanging on to their firearms that they will literally kill the police or soldiers who are trying to take the guns, I guess. That seems to be what they're saying. But at least in New Zealand, people are more civilized than that, and they know that their own personal interest in these firearms is not more important than avoiding these sorts of massacres in the future. And so it has been quite successful. It did cost some money. About 200 million New Zealand dollars, roughly 129 million US dollars were used to pay for the program. But it is heartening to see a country take this sort of threat so seriously and decide in the wake of a tragedy that we're not interested in having another one or another 10 or another 50 over the next few years. We're gonna do what's necessary to stop it now. Meanwhile, Russia had a horrible tragedy involving the explosion during a testing of a nuclear missile. On August 8th, during testing aboard a barge in the White Sea, the nuclear engine of an experimental nuclear-armed cruise missile exploded, killing 2 technicians and injuring 6 others. That death toll has apparently risen to at least 5, depending on who you talk to. And so we have some idea of what was going on, but they're not actually talking. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov declined to confirm widespread international speculation that the accident involved a nuclear-powered cruise missile known as Skyfall. It is believed that that is what was going on though. And what's interesting is that people living in an area nearby are now being asked to evacuate, implying that this wasn't just an engine problem, that there was a nuclear component to this. Villagers were asked to leave Nyonoksa on Wednesday morning due to planned military activities, they're saying. So over 450 villagers are being either taken out by train or being asked to trek through a forest to get out of the area. A local correspondent for the independent investigative newspaper Novaya Gazeta said military officials told residents that the evacuation was not connected to Thursday's explosion. They said it's just a coincidence, it's a routine measure. I mean, I don't know who would believe that ever, but in the immediate aftermath of the release of the show Chernobyl, get out of that area if you can. It probably is far from routine. Or maybe in Russia it is routine. Maybe in Russia these sorts of accidents have become routine, but in either case, get out of that area while you still can. Now, there was no reason for Donald Trump to get involved in this situation, but he did, tweeting, "The United States is learning much from the failed missile explosion in Russia. We have similar, though more advanced technology. The Russian Skyfall explosion has people worried about the air around the facility and far beyond, not good." Now, what's interesting about that tweet is that he apparently has spilled the beans on some classified technology that we're working on, but that's just Donald Trump. He just reveals our missiles technology. Look, I had more, but I will just say this. Those people that died, the Russian military is saying, let's focus on the death of these heroes who died, and it is a tragedy that they died, and it's also 100% unnecessary that they died. They wouldn't have died if Russia wasn't continuing to try to develop these sorts of weaponry. All of these sorts of accidents, people die testing planes here in the US constantly because we have this never-ending hunger for more and more advanced technology in the area of weapons. Doesn't have to happen, not a single person needs to die in that way, but we're held back by this need to either feed the military-industrial complex in our country, whether it's the US or Russia, or engage in completely needless, tragic wars abroad. And this is just another example of how that can affect the people of a country. Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.